we are now going to transition to our next section. And so we put up our slide to introduce this section. We want to welcome everyone again to the JACC Heart Failure Virtual Journal Club. And this is an international journal club. We have participants from all over the world. We have the associate editors on the call. We have the authors and co-authors of the distinguished late-breaking science that's been presented recently in the journal. And the second theme is really an exciting one, probably the most important clinical trial to finish in 2020 will be GALACTIC-HF. I say that as a co-PI, the Victoria study that finished 2020, so hats off to you, John. And we are going to have an analysis of the GALACTIC-HF design and where we think this trial will land, when it will land, and what it will tell us. And then Dr. Bill Abraham led a important article in JACC Heart Failure with several of the associate editors on this call, Dr. Fuzat, Dr. Sopka, and myself, on how clinical heart failure trials have to adjust in the COVID and post-COVID era. Very important topic that I want to spend a lot of time discussing. So let's, John Teerlink, take us through GALACTIC-HF, design paper recently published, and very exciting to hear that enrollment is entirely completed, and we're in the follow-up phase.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris, and everybody for participating in this conference. And I look forward to going through the GALACTIC-HF design with everybody. Here are my particular relationships with industry, specifically with Amgen and Cytokinetics, which are sponsors of the trial. And thank you to the JACC editorial board for giving us the opportunity to present this design paper in such a great journal on GALACTIC-HF. And I'm presenting this on behalf of all of these authors and the multiple investigators who are involved. And so GALACTIC-HF is attempting to address an issue that is perhaps early in the pathophysiology of heart failure. We've all spent a lot of time talking about neurohormonal activation and affecting the beta adrenergic pathways, but none of the current therapies address the fundamental defect in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, which is in fact the initial decrease in systolic function. And so one of the goals of this program has been to develop something that can directly improve systolic function. You already mentioned the illustrious Mitch Sotka, who worked together with a group of folks to reclassify agents that improve cardiac performance. And we specifically looked at myotropes, which are the new group of agents that can affect the molecular motor and scaffolding and directly improve cardiac function. And the first agent in this class is omecamtiv mecarbil. So omecamtiv mecarbil is an agent that's a specific cardiac myosin activator. It increases contractility by binding specifically to the myosin head, and it stabilizes this head in the figure between the figure 1 and 2, the states of 1 and 2. It stabilizes the myosin head in this pre-power stroke state, making it more likely to bind to actin, and so that you end up having more force-generating molecules, such as the myosin head, on the actin filament. And this makes it more myosin available during the power stroke, which gives basically effectively more hands on the actin rope pulling and giving more force generation during the cardiac cycle. And this has been illustrated in this figure from the design manuscript, where on the panel B shows what it's like before omecamtiv mecarbil. Panel C, you see more of the activated myosin heads interacting with the actin filament. So the omecamtiv mecarbil program has had over 1,000 patients involved in its clinical development program. The studies range from healthy volunteers to patients with stable chronic heart failure or decompensated acute heart failure. And all these studies demonstrated that omecamtiv mecarbil improved cardiac function and was well tolerated with an AE profile similar to placebo. COSMIC-HF, the study listed last year, presented the most direct foundation for the phase 3 trial. So briefly, there are 150 group patients in each of these two groups represented here in the placebo group and the omecamtiv pharmacokinetic titrated group. And these patients received study drug for 20 weeks. And in this study, omecamtiv mecarbil prolonged the systolic ejection time, which is a function of these more hands pulling on the rope, if you will. And this resulted in panel B showing increased stroke volume, and panel C a decrease in left ventricular end systolic dimension. And this is after 20 weeks of oral therapy. Interestingly, there was also after 20 weeks a decrease in the left ventricular end diastolic dimension. And this is suggestive of beneficial reverse cardiac remodeling. In addition, we also saw a decrease in heart rate. And given that omecamtiv mecarbil has no effect on beta receptors or other receptors that would affect heart rate, we posit that this is actually due to sympathetic withdrawal, an improvement in neurohormonal activation after this therapy with omecamtiv mecarbil. And this is also reflected in the decrease in NT-proBNP that significantly occurred in this group. So this provided the foundation for GALACTIC-HF. And GALACTIC-HF enrolled patients who had a history of chronic heart failure with an ejection fraction less than or equal to 35%, who were symptomatic with NYHA class 2 to 4 symptoms. And we enrolled them from two different locations. So 25% of the patients were targeted to be enrolled from the hospital while they were admitted for the primary reason of heart failure. And then the rest of the trial were patients who had prior heart failure hospitalization or urgent heart failure admission within 1 year. All of the patients were managed with heart failure standard of care therapies. And we also, as we had been discussed, we had a BNP and NT-proBNP cutoffs for entry, and they were significantly higher for active atrial fibrillation or flutter. These patients were randomized 1-to-1, and the analysis were randomized with a stratification based on where they were randomized from, both in terms of hospital or out of hospital, as well as their region. And there were multiple evaluations during the course of the trial, and it's an event-driven trial. So the hypothesis of GALACTIC was, could selectively improving cardiac function with this cardiac myosin activator, omecamtiv mecarbil, improve clinical outcomes in patients with HFrEF? And the primary endpoint is time to first cardiovascular death or heart failure event, with an emphasis on event. So patients who are hospitalized or go to the ER receiving intravenous therapies will count as an event. And then the secondary endpoints, which will be evaluated through a hierarchical testing procedure, include the first one, which is time to cardiovascular death. And the trial was actually powered to evaluate cardiovascular death. So we will stop the trial after around 1,590 events. In addition, we'll look for the change in quality of life through the KCCQ total symptom score, time to first heart failure hospitalization, and time to all-cause death. So as you already mentioned, we're fully enrolled in GALACTIC-HF with 8,256 patients, just short of the Paradigm trial's maximum. And this was achieved by the extraordinary efforts of over 1,000 sites in 35 countries. But this leads us to actually Bill's talk, which is GALACTIC-HF in the time of COVID-19. So what do? The primary goal of how we handled this was to ensure the safety of patients and study staff in this setting. The secondary goal was to ensure the integrity of patient study staff contributions to the clinical trial. And how did we address this issue? Well, we found innovative ways to distribute the investigational product, which involved curbside pickup by IP at sites and also regionally approved delivery services. And then for our study visits and the end of study evaluations, we converted them to virtual visits, deferred lab testing, and then we've also been careful to make sure that we documented the relatedness of all of these things to COVID-19, specifically including IP administration, data collection, and endpoint adjudication, as well as the visit type. So we're thrilled to have the opportunity to present the design to this group. Looking forward to hearing what folks say and any input and questions. So thanks very much, Chris.
John, terrific overview. And Wow, this is going to be exciting. Let me just ask, when will we have the results of GALACTIC-HF?
So we're in fourth quarter this year. So we're very
and that's dependent on crossing the 1,590 CV deaths.
Exactly. And we're certainly on track to do that. So we're really excited. Been a long
Let me
time.
ask one of our young senior statesman, associate editor, Dr. Barry Greenberg, who's seen a lot of inotropes and maybe not myotropes, but a lot of drugs that have come up to the wire and have not quite made it in this space. Barry, give us your historical perspective.
So, well, that's why we do large-scale clinical trials like this, because the mechanism of action looks extremely promising. The early clinical trial results look promising, but we've seen in the past with drugs like fluoxetine and bisnarenone, although they had different mechanism of action, they were inotropic agents and didn't cross the finish line. In fact, in the larger clinical trials, ended up having adverse effects and had to development had to be terminated for them. So I think it's a good sign that this study has continued this far. There is a data safety monitoring board that is overseeing this study. So one could assume that we haven't seen a negative signal, but we're going to have to wait to see if there is a positive signal here.
Yeah, Chris, if I can add to the illustrious Professor Greenberg's analysis there, one of the things that I really appreciate that the editors allowed us to do in the design paper was present some of the results of these prior failed studies. And if there is any, one of the things that is interesting is all of these studies demonstrated adverse mortality signal with well under 500 events, and we are well beyond that for now. So for whatever that's worth, and that's not guaranteeing anything in terms of significant positive results, but I feel very confident that that we're not going to see an adverse effect, certainly on mortality here.
One of the sort of unusual ways to think of clinical trialists is that we recruit for events. It's not so much the sample size, it's really the number of events, and you've highlighted that nicely. Maria Rosa has been an outstanding clinical investigator throughout her career, may have enrolled more patients in her career than your trial. Maria Rosa, give us your historical perspective here.
I think that I would just like to summarize it with one of the statements that John made, and that is that in the previous trial, specifically COSMIC-HF, there was a reduction in heart rate. And I think that perhaps that's the most promising aspect of this myotrope, because every single study with inotropic agents has been associated with increases in heart rate, and across the board, an increase in heart rate has been associated with poor outcomes. If you think about it, how one of the ways that we produce heart failure in animal models is to fast pace the animals. So to me, of everything that John said, all of which was fantastic, of course, the thing that attracts me most is the decrease in heart rate. I think that's very promising.
And let me just invite the audience to please submit your questions through the Q&A, and don't be shy. This group of experts is certainly not shy to comment. And I'm going to ask Mitch Sopka, who wrote a fantastic review article in JACC on this topic. Mitch, what do you think of this drug? The mechanism, maybe it's very different than all the other historical drugs that have come to pass.
Yeah, it certainly is different. I think, you know, the proof is going to be in the pudding, right? With all these drugs, does it actually improve outcomes? I think going along with what Maria Rosa said, it lowers heart rate, which is beneficial. It seems to lower natriuretic peptides. It seems to improve ventricular volumes, which have correlated with improvement in events in other clinical trials. So that is certainly, you know, suggestive that it may have an effect. I'm hopeful, certainly, that it will cause a benefit, and that we can, you know, really use this drug in patients who we're kind of otherwise limited in the drug options that we have. So if you think about the way that this drug mechanism works and its theoretic side effects, at least that we've seen in the 1,000 patients that we've seen so far, right, it doesn't seem to significantly cause vasodilation or lower blood pressure. It doesn't compete really with other agents that affect renal function or potassium, and so it really provides another therapeutic that doesn't have some of these other side effects. And you know, in the same way that the SGLT2 inhibitors are kind of finding that you can kind of add them on in many different cases, this has the potential to really provide that sort of change in our management style.
Great comments. Let me ask Dr. Felker. I know Dr. Felker is on the executive committee. When you design these trials, one of the fears, and I think you protected well against this in your design, but one of the fears when you enroll patients from the hospital is that, and you have a composite endpoint, you get a rush of the non-fatal endpoints that can dominate the fatal endpoints. And so I think you nicely put a protection in there that you wouldn't stop the trial until you had the set greater than 1,500 deaths. Could you comment on that, having been the PI of the guided trial, and how that how important that is?
Yeah, so it's, you know, there's several facets to that. Thanks, Chris. Obviously, the time that patients are in the hospital is a very attractive time to introduce new therapies because you're monitoring them every day. The fact that they've just gotten hospitalized sort of means that what you were doing was not working optimally and controlling and managing their heart failure. On the other hand, as we saw with Paradigm, you know, initially there was a lot of uncertainty about whether it was safe or advisable to do in the hospitalized setting until Pioneer came out. So I think, you know, we tried to be thoughtful about creating avenues that would reflect clinical practice. You're right, and we saw in GUIDED that there was a large number of hospitalizations that occurred very quickly after enrollment, and you know, maybe before there was time to have any modifying effect. This is a little bit different because it's a drug that actually changes physiology, where GUIDED was a strategy trial where presumably the strategy takes some time to actually see an effect. But you know, like Paradigm, this is a trial that's looking at the composite endpoint, but it's also very focused on cardiovascular mortality as a main objective, because we all still recognize that that's a critical, you know, the most critical issue.
Yeah, and Chris, if I can add to that, one of the things that I think all the executive committee, steering committee, and investigators did a great job of was making sure that the patients in GALACTIC-HF were well treated with that background therapy. So I don't think there are going to be any questions about kind of what would have happened if we had, you know, 87% of the patients on ACE, ARBs, or ARNIs, 94% on beta blockers, 77%, which I think is the highest in any trial, on MRAs.
Wow.
65% of the patients were on triple therapy. So, and 34% of the patients had CRT or ICD. So we had, and those numbers were very similar actually in the patients who were being discharged from the hospital. So, so I think the investigators did a great job of kind of getting people on their best possible therapies for the trial. And that was presented at our virtual ACC.
Tarek, you had a nice question. Please articulate that.
Absolutely, Dr. O'Connor. Just taking sitting back and looking at the overall picture, we had incredible results from Paradigm, but the uptake of Entresto was not great. And we've seen the same thing with SGLT2 inhibitors, where there's an incredible improvement in clinical outcomes, but uptake is poor. So we know that few therapies in heart failure make the patients feel a lot better. And if you were to prefer the outcome, would it be that the KCCQ changes is massive with a slight clinical outcome, or vice versa, with a large clinical improvement and little change in KCCQ?
You left out the most important answer, which is both. And so, I think we can talk about a lot of the reasons for why sacubitril valsartan has some difficulty in uptake. It's making us give up our babies with ACE inhibitors. It caused hypotension and other things that people were trying to figure out how to use it. The SGLT2 inhibitors, until recently, haven't actually been indicated in heart failure per se. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens now that DAPA, it's been approved and things that along those lines for heart failure itself. But in terms of omecamtiv mecarbil specifically, we would hope that it would be able to do both. And the advantage here is that because, and Mitch related some of this already, that because it doesn't affect blood pressure, because it doesn't have a dramatic direct effect on heart rate, it doesn't affect kidney function, it doesn't affect potassium, it's an agent that will be very easy to use. And so it should be able to be used regardless of what benefit it provides. Based on what we saw on the preliminary data, we're hoping that it actually will, short of me being just a smart aleck in my answer, we really are hoping that we'll do both. And I think there's a lot of biological plausibility where it would do both. But I think your point's really important, that we need to start looking at agents that will improve quality of life as well. And I know you've been doing some great work on considering how we might be able to do that as well. So I look forward to seeing some of that evolve too.
Let me ask Dr. Fuzat, who works with the FDA and helped develop a guidance document around this topic, and that is the importance of PROs, quality of life. Could they be used as approvable endpoints in clinical trials if you don't meet a mortality or hard clinical endpoint signal? Dr. Fuzat?
Yes, you can hear me? As you know, many of you were in the meeting this summer to introduce the FDA guidance document that we worked really hard on to elaborate on what Tarek just said, which is improvements in quality of life without necessarily having the hard endpoints. And we also published a paper on this and included the HFSA patient survey on their preferences. But clearly, from an FDA standpoint, you want to use hard endpoints for safety, but not necessarily for efficacy in every case. So I think it's an important point.
We have a question from our audience. Dr. Teerlink, a question about SGLT2 inhibitors. The use of it has been low. It's hard to, when you have new therapies dropping in the middle of a trial, how do you adjust for that?
Well, so there are a couple ways to think about it. One is there a biological plausibility for a competing risk where it might detract from the beneficial effect of other agents or things? So there are certain agents that seem to have competing risks along those lines. So with ivabradine and beta blockers, those clearly kind of were targeting the same kind of mechanism in some respects. So you're right, though, in terms of the SGLT2 inhibitors, we only had in GALACTIC-HF, it was about 3% of the patients who were on SGLT2 inhibitors. So we're not going to have a lot of data on how they interact. I don't see a lot of interaction between the mechanisms and things, so I could see them being very complementary and mutually beneficial. So that's kind of the answer to the SGLT2 inhibitors. In regards to the quality of life, I did forget to mention that we are doing an independent another trial, which maybe we'll send the design manuscript to you guys for this one too, on meteoric HF is one that that Mike Felker is doing, and with Greg Lewis and things on functional capacity, MVO2, and kind of a patient's quality of life with omecamtiv mecarbil in the same heart failure population. So we are going to be looking at QOL in that way, but it's going to be a challenge to figure out how to mesh all these medicines. And I think that's going to be the next stage of our heart failure therapy development. How do we incorporate an ARNI, a beta blocker, an MRA, Vabradine, Verashiguat, and omecamtiv mecarbil, hopefully, and all these different therapies in terms of taking the best possible care of our patients. So.
And I'm going to let Joe had a question on exercises, and then we're going to pivot a little bit to talk about the COVID era and have Bill Abraham present his comments on it.
John, first, congratulations on a Herculean effort to get the trial enrolled. I think it's just terrific. I wondered if you could give us any insights about this drug on either submaximal or maximal exercise capacity.
Great question, and I think that's exactly what Meteoric HF is designed to study, and so we'll have a chance to address that. Mike Felker is one of the PIs, so Mike, do you want to try to address that? Are you interested in?
Sure. So yeah, it's a critical question as we think about, one way to think about this is to think about the spectrum of benefits patients can have. So they can live longer, they can stay in the hospital, they can have fewer symptoms, they can have improved maximal or submaximal exercise capacity. So you might classify those as doing more. And, one of the nice things about this program is at the end, we're going to have really robust randomized data around each of those domains of benefit with this drug. And the truth is, for most drugs that are beneficial, to Tarek's question, these things are not very disconnected. So if you look at dapagliflozin, it improves morbidity, mortality, and quality of life, and similar for sacubitril/valsartan. So we actually don't have very many therapies that are heavy on outcomes and light on quality of life, or vice versa. But I think it's a critical piece of the puzzle that we're going to have excellent data from Meteoric.
Well, this is a great segue to have Bill Abraham talk about his analysis of how trials should adjust in the COVID era. We've got really two trials with this drug. Galactic HF had to make some adjustments perhaps in the follow-up phase, and Mike, you're leading the exercise study that you just described, and that's got a very challenged endpoint when you're in an era of a pandemic that doesn't allow you to bring patients back. So, Bill, why don't you give us a summary of your paper at JACC Heart Failure?
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. And, I too like to welcome everybody who's attending tonight's Journal Club. So the paper that I'll refer to was published first in March online as a preprint and appears in print in this month's JACC Heart Failure. Many of the concepts that I'll discuss are covered in that article on the editor's page of JACC Heart Failure. But I think this is a work in progress and a learning process as we continue to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll say up front that if there is, from the clinical trial standpoint, any silver lining to this pandemic, it is that the pandemic is forcing us to consider innovative ways to execute heart failure clinical trials that may result in greater clinical trials efficiency in the future. So certainly some of the things that I'll mention were necessitated by the COVID-19 pandemic, but might be considered going forward in some future time of global disruption, or perhaps even as a routine in the conduct of heart failure clinical trials to improve efficiency. Now, John's already mentioned a really key principle that we brought out in this paper, and that is that the safety and the well-being of heart failure trial participants, including future participants, and research team members are really of the utmost importance. Minimizing risk, minimizing COVID-19 exposure for patients and for research team members really was the #1 priority, and everything else that we, recommended in this paper came after that. And of course, a close second to this was preserving the integrity of the clinical trial due to the disruptions. So there are a number of challenges that are outlined in this paper, and certainly a number of solutions proposed. For example, one of the challenges as we began to close our institutions to in-person patient visits, to elective cardiac procedures, elective diagnostic procedures, in-person follow-up visits in the clinic, was, how do we actually perform follow-up visits in these patients without increasing substantially the number of follow-up visits that are done out of window, without increasing substantially the amount of missing data available at the end of the day. So one of the first recommendations or proposed solutions here was to leverage telehealth and to move those in-clinic or in-person study assessments to remote assessments. And the notion was to maintain as best as possible the integrity of the clinical trials activity, particularly for patients who are already enrolled, acknowledging that enrollment might slow or stop temporarily for many trials. The goal was to continue to collect follow-up data on patients already in the trial. And there are a number of items that can be assessed remotely: adverse events, clinical outcomes, such as heart failure hospitalizations or events. And there are a number of other follow-up items in heart failure clinical trials, such as the administration of a quality of life questionnaire, that likewise we believe could be done effectively and efficiently using telehealth or remote assessment type of platforms. We did acknowledge that for some trials, delayed in-person procedures would result in, for example, the delay of some or certain types of study interventions. For example, for a device trial that requires a device implantation, while our cath labs are closed to elective procedures and to clinical trials procedures, those procedures inevitably would have to be delayed and needed to be taken into account. There are a number of statistical considerations that need to be thought of. John also mentioned for GALACTIC-HF, and we think this applies to really all heart failure clinical trials conducted during the COVID-19 era. We've got to know as best as possible COVID-19 exposure infection status in these patients. So we want to collect prospectively, where available, data on confirmed COVID-19 positivity or when COVID-19 is suspected. And we're encouraging clinical trialists and study sponsors to consider systematically collecting serological tests in these patients in order to ascertain COVID-19 status. This will be important in analysis and interpretation of data. There are a lot of potential ways to adjust for COVID-19 positivity or to do sensitivity analyses around it that should be taken into account. And then finally, while we expected that during the COVID-19 pandemic, enrollment activities might slow substantially or even come to a halt, that there are means in order to maintain screening activities with research personnel working from home if they have access to the electronic health record, screening the EHR, screening the telehealth clinics, in order to assemble lists of potentially, eligible patients for clinical trials that could be rapidly enrolled in the study, once we get back to some form of business that appears to be normal. In terms of reopening at sites, we've acknowledged that there might be some geographical differences, either on a region by region or country by country, or even on a site by site basis for the timing of reopening or reactivating sites to enrollment, or in the case of device trials, to implantation of investigational devices. And perhaps there are a few adaptations that I haven't yet mentioned that we can discuss during the Q&A. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd refer you to the paper in print in this month's issue of JACC Heart Failure. And again, this is a work in progress as we're all learning how to adjust or adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're learning lots of new lessons and perhaps better ways to adapt our trial to this major global disruption. Thank you.
Really important for trialists and sponsors, investigators. We had a more detailed workshop that Bill co-chaired with me. Mitch Sopka is involved in that. I'll ask Mitch to comment on some of these things. But gosh, if you think of all the things that affect, what we need is universal testing that's broad and cheap, and that'll be a big solution. And I know that's what we're pushing in health systems, and the trials will require that also. Mitch, what do you think the biggest issues are for endpoints in clinical trials, perhaps like GALACTIC-HF? Obviously, increased mortality, different types of mortality, different types of mode of hospitalization. Give us your thoughts.
Oh, that's a big one. Thank you. So if you're looking at endpoints, I want to take the easy ones first, which are the kind of major outcome endpoints. So the echocardiograms, the BNP changes, all of these became much harder to do. We've tried to get around some of them by sending a home nurse to draw blood, or we even considered sending a home, a mobile echocardiographer out to a house. But really, a lot of those secondary endpoints will just have to get dropped. And so if you're looking at phase 2 kind of mechanistic trials, you're going to end up having to really pause or stop those trials. And as that's kind of happened with, say, the METEORIC trial, where they really required cardiopulmonary stress tests, and that can't really be done outside of, coming to the hospital. I think when you start talking about hard outcomes in terms of hospitalizations and mortality, there are two issues. One is that you end up with fewer patients, and we've seen this throughout kind of all medical conditions, fewer patients coming to the hospital. Everyone is so scared of getting the disease that they are willing to stay at home and have their acute MIs at home and have other kind of decompensations at home. So we're seeing fewer hospitalizations, so it's changed the proportion of your events. But the other issue is that we are seeing that you have patients who are dying, particularly out of the hospital, and you're unsure if that is a COVID event or if that is a heart failure event. And even if you start thinking about, is it associated with a rise in BNP, a rise in troponin, were they short of breath at the time, that doesn't necessarily help you distinguish if that is a COVID event or a heart failure event, and that gets very complicated. So I think that what it's going to come down to is trying to figure out, which of those things is at play, and then honestly, statistically, it's going to come down to adjusting the analysis so that you're really accounting for what you can't adjudicate, which is know what the true event was.
And so, Bill, to mitigate some of this risk, some trialists have said, listen, we're going to put a date, in the U.S. it might be March 15th, and say we're going to stratify the analysis based on patients who've completed the trial before then, or enrolled and completed before then versus after. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a reasonable approach to consider, but I think that there are other alternatives as well. And I suspect that, again, since this is uncharted territory and we're all learning here, we're going to analyze these data in multiple ways. Some of them might, look at COVID-19 as a sort of time-dependent, covariate. Others, may try to ascertain as best as possible COVID-19 status and do sensitivity analyses around that. I think Mitch, outlines probably the greatest challenge is that there are going to be unknowns here as well. And how we handle those unknowns will become complicated. But I do think that we're going to need to, call upon our investigators to provide us as much information as possible. We need to start introducing into our AE reporting, some notion around COVID relatedness, confirmed, suspected, not COVID-19. I've seen all those scenarios already. I have, in some of the trials I'm involved with, patients who have died in countries where COVID-19 has been highly prevalent, and they had testing and they were COVID-19 positive. They died, and investigators have reported that as the primary cause of death. There are others, a patient who dies in a nursing home in Spain during the, peak of the COVID pandemic there, and in a nursing home where COVID-19 was shown to be highly prevalent, but this particular patient was never tested. Maybe we call that a COVID-19, suspected, death. And we're going to have to ask our adjudication committees to work through these as well. The patient that comes in COVID-19 positive with worsening heart failure, is that a primary hospitalization for, COVID-19? Is that a primary hospitalization for heart failure? Based on the way our endpoints work with a focus on cardiovascular death and heart failure hospitalization, what bucket we put these events in may have a significant impact on the outcomes of these trials.
Jim Januzzi, you've been in one of the hot spots in the country, and obviously have worked in the inpatient service. We saw, as you did, a significant reduction in STEMIs, strokes, heart failure hospitalizations, all dropped by 50% in April. How does that affect the clinical trial?
Well, I mean, the answer is obvious. If we're talking about time to event type analyses, it's going to have an influence there. The other thing is we're now seeing a catching up effect where the cases are coming back. Last week on clinical service, every patient up on the floor was non-elective. They were all much more complex with heart failure, larger myocardial infarction than if they had come in sooner. And I suspect the acuity will continue to rise as we are catching up more and more. The other thing, again, I mean, just to address, in the era of competing risk, now that there's another number one for mortality in the United States, specifically COVID-19, one has to worry that whatever affects therapies that we give our patients outside of that dominant risk for death, any benefits might be less obvious now. And so a drug that in other times might have been beneficial might not show the same benefits in this current situation. So there's a lot that needs to be thought about, and the time-varying covariate type approaches, as Bill mentioned, I think is going to be critically important.
John and Mike, as leaders of these clinical trials that have been affected, patient has fearful to come into the hospital, has sudden death. The local doctor puts on the death certificate COVID-19. How is that adjudicated?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. I mean, as has been said, it's a big challenge. I mean, on the one hand, we have a lot of unknown deaths actually in clinical trials where people die at home and we don't know the exact circumstances often. But in the setting of whether it's New York or Lombardy or Barcelona, some area with very high COVID activity, when that happens, it's even more challenging. And I think the key in adjudication is often there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. The key is consistency and being systematic about how you classify events so that your errors are, that they're that you don't bias your results towards one arm or the other. But it definitely does create major challenges. Meteoric, which is, we were really ramping up enrollment, just getting ready to start enrollment in Europe when this started. So as was said, we have a cardiopulmonary exercise testing endpoint, which, I told Greg Lewis, I don't think you can do this in PPE. I think we're having very active discussions, and we already have tried to adjust windows for things and how we're going to approach, making sure our data is good, and obviously the timelines are extended.
Yeah, for Galactic. Chris, you're on mute still.
All right. Make your final comments, and we'll wrap it up.
I'm very happy to hear what Mike said, because he's the chair of our clinical events committee as well. So thank you for doing it. But I think, that randomization will hopefully take care of much of these issues, for one thing. And secondly, so the main impact, at least in terms of Galactic HF, may be in terms of reducing our power and treatment effect a little, though we're hoping that probably for our trial, it's not going to be that big a deal. One of the other interesting points is if you look at kind of Paradigm and a lot of the positive heart failure trials, among those trials, there was actually reduction as well in pneumonias, bronchitis, asthma, and some have said, oh, those are misclassification. Those are actually heart failure events. But some have actually proposed that if your heart failure is actually better controlled and better managed, you may be able to be less susceptible to dramatic and bad effects of other, such as things like influenza and things. And I know you guys did a great study on influenza and things. So we'll looking forward to hearing what that all shows. But anyway, so I'm very encouraged by how the international community has drawn together to try to address this pandemic, this issue, both in terms of the care of our patients and in terms of protecting the integrity of our clinical trials. And Bill, you did a great job of summarizing that, so thank you.
Well, this has been a terrific commentary on the state of clinical research and this program and natriuretic peptides. And I want to thank our associate editors and our authors and co-authors for a very dynamic discussion in the JACC Heart Failure Virtual Journal Club. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.